Can you guess where we are right now? That's right, it's Water Street in our hometowns of Sauk City and Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin. Water Street runs along the banks of the Wisconsin River through both villages. You may have been on this street hundreds of times on your way to school, but have you ever thought, where did this street and all of the buildings come from? They couldn't have built themselves, right? Well, thanks to historians, we have found out that Water Street is about 180 years old. Water Street was the main street where you could buy food, dresses, and tools, get your mail, and eat food at a cafe. That means Water Street is full of rich history and stories about the people who lived here. So let's take a tour of historic Water Street, see the buildings, and hear the stories. So, who built Water Street? Well, they were your ancestors who traveled here from Europe. In our area, most of the immigrants came from Germany. Smaller groups came from Switzerland, Scandinavia, Holland, Poland, and Ireland. Where did your ancestors come from? Ask your mom and dad tonight. Our first stop on Water Street is the Tripp Heritage Museum in Prairie du Sac. Let's go in and meet the keeper of artifacts of Sauk Prairie's past.
Welcome to the Tripp Heritage Museum. My name is Jack Barrett. I'm the manager of the museum. The building you're in used to be the Prairie du Sac Library, and it was built in 1912, and the money came from the gentleman behind me whose name was J.S. Tripp. Mr. Tripp was a lawyer, and he became a money lender. He personally lent out his money to people, and then ultimately he became a banker. In 1912, he donated about $11,000 to the village of Prairie du Sac, and this building was built then as the first public library in Prairie. So the building was the library here in town probably for about 85 years until the mid to late 90s, and then the Sauk Prairie Area Historical Society relocated here, and it's been the Tripp Heritage Museum since that time. Okay, we've got some other cool stuff here that we call artifacts, so we're going to walk around here and let's start looking. Well, this is the Bradford bison, and it's probably our most special relic in the museum. It has been determined to be 5,000 to 7,000 years old, and was discovered in 2005 by a young first grader here in Sauk Prairie Schools. His name was Joshua Bradford, and he was out after school one afternoon with his big brother, Bob Weiss, and they went down to the river by the Prairie du Sac Dam. And they were looking around for, like fishing lures and kind of just scrounging the sand. And he saw like a tip of what turned out to be a horn. They went out and plucked it out of the riverbed. It was kind of a odd looking piece of, they didn't know what it was, if it was bone or if it was wood. So they went to the State Historical Society in Madison, and they just flipped. I mean, they saw right away that this was an ancient bison occidentalist that they had believed to have been around Sauk Prairie 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, but they had never had any proof of it. So this was quite a major discovery. In fact, it was so unique that they named it the Bradford bison, which is Joshua's last name, obviously. So that's kind of unusual for a kid outside of the university to get a relic like this named after him. Okay, the bison that Joshua found in 2005 is actually extinct, and it was a much bigger buffalo than what we know as the American buffalo. In fact, this case is a pretty good example of the size of it in terms of from here to the floor is about 7 feet. That bison occidentalist was the same height from hoof up to hump, and it was also about twice the size of this case, and it was about 2,000 pounds, so it was big. So have you ever wondered what the area looked like before our ancestors, the Europeans, came here? This is a great painting that was done here years ago by a local artist, and it shows the area which is known as the prairie, hence the Sauk Prairie. So you have a wide open area of a lot of vegetation and just some animals, and those would be what we just talked about here a little bit, probably the bison occidentalist. At the time there were some Native Americans here, and basically that was their food, so they would hunt these buffalo with actual arrows made from stone heads. So these are hence called arrowheads. That's kind of what we see here, is just a complete different style of life at that time before the Europeans actually settled here in the 1830s. So this is what's called a diorama, and this is kind of a cool piece of furniture, if you want to call it that. Actually, it was built in the 1930s during the Depression. This depicts a scene of when the Sauk or Sac Indians at the time were sort of, if you will, discovered by a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Carver, who was an American explorer. And you can see in the background here, that's the actual Wisconsin River. And it shows him when he came here. He came down in canoes with a number of people, and they actually stopped and talked to the Sauk Indians. And they surmised basically that this was a village of several thousand people, and it was very nicely laid out, almost as a village. And because he wrote this in a journal, we can say pretty much that that was the discovery of the area here. So these were the Sauk or Sac Indians, and hence the name Prairie du Sac and Sauk City. So we're on the second floor of the Tripp Museum now, and what we have here is a collection of 325 birds, mounted specimens actually, that have been here since 1936 when this was the Tripp Library. So these were donated by Ed Ochsner and his brother, and these were local fellows that were actually amateur taxidermists, and they donated all of their specimens here to the library. And they've been here now for a little over 80 years. We've had a lot of people come here from the area that'll check out some of these and mention that they've seen them in their backyard. They didn't know what they were. So a lot of people just come here to kind of search and find. And can you identify some of these birds, including one little hummingbird that's over here in the corner, which is about the size of my thumb?
Thanks, Jack, for showing us through the Tripp Museum. Now, let's continue our walk down Water Street to Sauk City. We have arrived at Turner Hospital. This limestone building was built in 1859. Originally, it was a blacksmith shop and office. But in 1917, this building became the first hospital in the Sauk Prairie area. It was founded by Mrs. Markquart Turner. She operated the hospital under the supervision of Dr. Layler. Having lived in Roxbury for many years, Mrs. Turner was well known for her talent in handling sick folks with a very kind disposition. Because there was a second apartment attached to the main house, she was able to live here and successfully operate a hospital with 10 beds until 1941. Here are the roots of the healthcare facility we have today. Now, look at the stone in this building. The architectural style is called block and stack. See the one big block and 3 or 4 thin blocks stacked on top of each other? Thus, block and stack. 3 Swiss masons are credited with this style of stone architecture, only known in our Sauk Prairie area. Investigate our 2 villages and the countryside to find more block and stack homes and barns. Now let's take a quick jog down Water Street to our next stop, Cello Bottling. Have you ever tried Sundrop or heard of Cello Pop? This is where the yummy soda pops were made and bottled. In 1924, Albert Getsko moved his soda pop bottling company here to this 2-story stucco building. It was called Riverside Bottling Company. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s, the Riverside Bottling Works did very well with its Sundrop brand of soda pop. But when Getsko died in 1930, the business passed to his daughter Cora and her husband Lawrence Johnson, who renamed the business Cello Bottling Works. Why the name Cello? Well, Cello takes its name from the celery-flavored soda produced during World War II in response to sugar rationing. Celery! Who knew you could make soda with that? Well, after the war, Lawrence acquired thousands of glass bottles stamped with the Cello logo, which then prompted the name change. The new Cello Pop came in many flavors: Coca-Cola, cream soda, strawberry, grape, orange, black cherry, lemon, and root beer. The 7-ounce bottles were very popular during the 50s and 60s. The soda was very flavorful as it used only pure cane sugar as a sweetener. The bottling works closed on December 31st, 2006 with the death of the last owner. It was one of the last of the small soft drink bottling companies in the country. If you look across the street, you will see the Hausmann House. It was one of the nicest homes in Sauk City in the 1860s. Instead of ordinary wood, this house was built with handsome yellow bricks. This home at 717 Water Street was built by Charles Hallett, cousin to Count Horazzi. They were among the first settlers who arrived here in 1840. Considered a dignified man, people called him the Squire. Charles anticipated building materials would be needed in a growing community, so Charles got into the lumber business. When he married Emma Rentdorf, he built a 1-story brick house around 1848. In time, a 2-story addition was constructed onto the smaller home in the 1860s. Finally, the original 1-story home was taken down, and a new brick addition was placed onto the north side of the home, which is the home you see in front of you today. Charles and Emma gave this house to their daughter Bertha. She married Paul Lockman, who took over her father's lumber company. The lumber company operated for 102 years. Lockman family members continued to live in this house until 1944. Today it continues as a single-family home. Right next door, we have the Fred Schlumbaum home. Carl Ferdinand Schlumbaum, or Fred for short, came to Sauk City in 1851 and married Louisa Kale. In 1856, they built this small brick home just south of the Charles Hallett's house. Louisa died in 1860, leaving Fred with 4 children. In 1862, Fred married 18-year-old Anna Durst, and she became mother to Fred's children. Fred was a harness maker by trade. He and his son Carl operated their own harness shop at 826 Water Street and remained there until 1911. The store was covered with bridles, reins, and horse collars. The air was filled with the smells of oiled leather. Harness makers were a vital part to any community. Fred made gear that enabled horses and mules to pull plows, mowers, harvesters, wagons, buggies, and sleds. Later, they built another 2-story brick commercial building at 824 Water Street, where they rented space to the Sauk City Post Office. This house remained a single-family home until 1967. Since that time, this house has served a number of commercial uses: a newspaper office, an agricultural union office, and a toy store. Today, it is a lovely vintage resale shop. Let's walk next door to this 2-story building. This building was built in 1866 by Christian Schum. The Schum family lived upstairs, and downstairs successfully ran a saloon business for 20 years. Then in 1888, Conrad and Selina Yeager converted the saloon into a general store selling only dry goods. No perishable food was sold here. In 1911, William Schwenker refitted the building for a harness shop. Schwenker, like Fred Schlumbaum and Otto Hahn, was one of many harness makers in Sauk City until the automobile made their leather craft obsolete. But in 1911, there was plenty of work. The Schwenker's son Hugo followed his father in the harness business and added cabinet making to his trade. Have you ever heard of the famous writer August Derleth? Well, Hugo was a good friend and sidekick of August Derleth. Hugo appears in many of Derleth's stories, under an assumed name, as a character who had a great love for the adventures on the river. At 735 Water Street stands the Knops building. This small 18 by 24 foot single-story commercial building was built sometime in the 1860s. Its architectural style is called a temporary building, which was a common sight along Water Street during the early settlement days of Sauk City. Temporary buildings were designed to be easily erected, easily moved, and not meant to last a long time. They were temporary. These simple constructed buildings of wood served as incubators for new business. Rents were low, and when the business became profitable, the tenant would purchase the lot and construct a permanent building, usually of brick. Today, this building is the last of this architectural style in Sauk City. Purchased by Charles and Rosalie Knops in 1869, this building remained in the Knops family for 80 years. Another building further down Water Street is the Markquart drugstore. August Markquart had become a pharmacist at the young age of 18. After serving in the Civil War, Markquart married Emma Coonradi, whose father was also a pharmacist in the South Business District at 922 Water Street. August helped Emma's father run the pharmacy for many years and continued to do so after Emma's father died. In 1910, they decided to build a new building and finally moved into this two-story brick building in 1911. It was called the Corner Drugstore. It also had a phone and a soda fountain, which was really cool in the day. Directly across the street is the classic State Bank building. It was built in 1913 in the classical revival style. Fancy, isn't it? People felt safe putting their money in this bank. However, in December of 1933, this bank was robbed by two gun-wielding Depression-era thugs. After ordering the employees and customers into the bank vault and telling them not to set off the alarm, they fled in a Ford V8 coach. Fleeing through Dane and Jefferson counties, stealing cars, wounding two, the thugs were arrested in Milwaukee and convicted. Insurance covered the bank loss. The bank managed to last through the Depression, but unfortunately closed in 1935. Since then, this bank building has housed numerous businesses. Today, it is a financial advisory and investment company. Now let's head south on Water Street to a small triangle of land at the corners of Carolina, South Water, and John Adams Street. Here stands a local landmark, the Liberty Pole. Once a large village green, the Liberty Pole was located in the center of the local business district in the 1800s. The custom of having a Liberty Pole was actually brought over from England. This is where children played, families picnicked, and the local militia drilled. Community ceremonies, concerts, and announcements were also enjoyed here. There was always a tall pole, 100 feet tall, and was used as a rallying point for the village. The Liberty Pole symbolized national freedom and personal liberty. In 1922, the Liberty Pole was moved to the side of the new toll-free bridge. It is said that before the Civil War, it was called the Liberty Pole, but after the Civil War, it was the flagpole. Our last stop is actually where the history of Sauk City begins. Behind this house at 1200 Water Street, a giant cottonwood tree once stood on the banks of the Wisconsin River. With a trunk diameter of 3 feet, this cottonwood was used as a witness tree. Well, what's that, you might ask? A witness tree is a natural landmark chosen by a mapmaker as a starting point, and which helps certify that the town lines, blocks, and streets on the map are true. This cottonwood tree may have grown up to 100 feet tall. Any traveler on river or footpath would have been able to see this tall landmark and use it as a guide on their journey. It no longer stands today, but a marker points to where it once stood. The site is open for viewing, so take a drive over to the site and look for yourself. Thank you for joining us on our walk of historic Water Street. Every artifact and every building has a unique story to tell us. Sauk City is full of them, and there are so many more you and your family can discover. We hope you enjoyed learning the stories about these buildings on Water Street.